Now you can hear Military Matters Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard and Sundays at noon on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on the iHeart Radio, TuneIn and Audacy apps. This episode is brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post 9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information. Well, folks, we are at the end of the season, and the show is saying farewell to our long-standing co-host, Jack Murphy. We are sad to see him go, but also happy for him as he pursues new goals and new stories to tell. But before he leaves, I wanted to share a little bit about his story, especially for those of you who have not read his book, Murphy's Law. Now, there's a lot to unpack with Jack, but I'm going to do my very best. One other reason for this interview is honestly somewhat selfish, and that's my own personal curiosity about his life. Now, I talked briefly in this interview, really this conversation, about how weird it is to know someone and then read a book about them. It felt weird for me at times, like I shouldn't know these things unless he was telling me personally. But that's exactly what his book is, right? It's him telling us about his life through, his words, but it's nevertheless, it's still a bit weird to not have that person tell you themselves. So as I read his book, there were times I had questions about those experiences, how he'd handled things, years after the fact. And some of the questions about really how is he now reflecting on some of those experiences he shares in his book. So really, it's a way for us to kind of catch up with where Jack is today, what he's going to be doing next, and to learn a little bit about what has made Jack Murphy so controversial, so polarizing for those in the SOF community. So without further ado, folks, my conversation with Jack Murphy. All right, Jack Murphy. Let's start with, we're gonna start at the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, man. How did young Jack Murphy grow up and find the Army?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a town which at the time was called North Tarrytown, changed its name to Sleepy Hollow around like 96 or 97. So yeah, that is the town where the legend of Sleepy Hollow comes from. I grew up in the suburbs outside New York City, essentially. And it was a cool place, I guess. As a kid, I was incredibly bored. As early on as I can remember, I had some sort of interest in the military, whether it was like those old, like black and white, like World War II movies, or, later on, I recall, I must have been like 9 or 10 or something like that, watching a VHS tape of Clear and Present Danger. And there's that scene where the SAS guys come up across the sand dunes, all blacked out and everything. And I remember like my little child's mind trying to understand. I'm like, this isn't like a war. It's not like World War II. Like, what are they doing? And I asked my mom, and she was like, oh, it's a secret mission. I was like, secret mission? They didn't do that? And she's like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, hell yeah, son. That's what I want to do.
So mom sparked that match. She sparked that interest in you. Like, yeah, secret
unintentionally,
like,
unintentionally. I think she probably wanted me to play the piano or do any number of other things other than that. But I think that was when like the first little idea in the back of my mind clicked about special operations. Like, what is that? And then I remember taking books out from the school library, and you could find a little of these like encyclopedias, like the book about everything, and it would have like maybe like 3 or 4 pages about like special forces in it. And then I remember one illustration, it had like the whole loadout of like all the kit they take out on patrol. And like, this was like, it was referencing Vietnam era stuff. And I was like, camo stick, 1 quart canteen. I'm like, hell yeah, this is all the stuff I want to have. And so, yeah, that interest just grew as I got older and became a teenager.
So we're gonna move past some of those teenage years. We really don't
Sure.
want to hear about those awkward times where
That's
you're
fine.
discovering my voice is changing. But you get to this point in your life where you're joining the army, and of course you're sitting in front of your recruiter, and they've got all these career paths. And I've sat down with my own kids, with their recruiters, and I've heard all the different pitches. What what was it that clicked in the back of your head, said, I am going to do this. I am going to go into this infantry thing, and I want to be a ranger and start actually going down this path.
Yeah, I mean the interest in it just grew and grew, and actually, so before 9/11, I was thinking actually about running off to join the French Foreign Legion because I thought that was a better chance to see some action. You get deployed to Africa or something like that. But then after 9/11 happened, it was very clear that like America was going to war, and the U.S. military was going to be the place to be. So, the recruiters didn't have to pitch me. I was a walk-in. I was the holy grail of recruitment. But I walked into the Marine Corps recruiter, and the guy kind of turned me off a lot. I wanted to join Marine infantry and then go recon at some point. That was like, I thought that would be the but when I got there, the guy tried to like hard sell me, which was very odd. I was like, you don't have to sell me. I'm already sold. And so I walked out of there, went and talked to the Army. The Army can put you right into the Ranger program. I was like, absolutely, that's what I want to do, and signed up.
So from the ranger world, you go in and you're accumulating all this experience as a young ranger. You deploy, you come back. You've got all this experience, all this training under your belt. What was missing that you said, I want to go pursue this Green Beret thing? What part of that whole experience did you say something's missing here?
Well, I wouldn't say that something was missing. I mean, Ranger Battalion was and is great in so many ways. I love the Ranger Regiment, but for me personally, there were a couple of things that were like, if it felt like it was time to move on to the next thing. I mean, one of them, do I really want to spend the rest of my Army career like yelling at privates because they're wearing the wrong color socks or the wrong type of belt? Like, is that really my thing? And then, going on deployment was great, but I mean, back in garrison, I mean, after you've seized Lawson Airfield about 15 times, it's like, dude, I'm ready to move on to something different. And so there were a couple of like anecdotes that I think like maybe summarize like, why I felt it was time to move on. I mean, one of them was I was asked to cut the grass around the company area because as a E4, I guess I was probably a tabbed spec 4 at that point. Like, okay, gonna go cut the grass. Lawnmower doesn't work. What's wrong with the lawnmower? Spark plugs are busted. Okay, so I need to go get new spark plugs. And so I'm going about that, and E5 over me figures out what I'm doing and is like, oh no, oh hell no, Murphy, stand down. What are you doing? Are you crazy? That's way above your pay grade. I'm like, bro, I'm a sniper in the Ranger Regiment. You're telling me changing out spark plugs in a lawnmower is above my pay grade? There's a very like, unless you've been in the military, unless you've been in that environment, I think it's hard for people to understand that there are like these two very different worlds. Like you're going on deployment and you're hunting down high value targets and people are trusting you to do this incredibly important job. And then you get back to garrison and it's like, people are stressed out about, again, what color socks you're wearing. And that's like very jarring. It's very jarring. There's like this culture clash that's going on between garrison and combat that I don't think that's totally unique to the Ranger Regiment either. I think you probably find that across the military. But anyway, I mean, I think it was pretty clear to me that I was not necessarily like the sort of brainwashed team leader or would be the squad leader that they necessarily were looking for. I mean, my first sergeant tried to convince me to stay and be a squad leader, and maybe I should have listened to him because it would have been a great experience. But it was around that time, summer of 2000. No. I'm sorry. It was winter. It was the last SFAS class of 2005 that I went. Then I came back to battalion and I was allowed to continue being a team leader and retain my position and train soldiers right up until I left for the Q course. So that was sometime in 2006.
So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there's a very and before I go any further, folks, go check out his book. He really goes into some detail. I know we're skipping a whole bunch of stuff here, a bunch of stuff, but I do have to touch on this key moment in your Ranger career, and you talk about it explicitly in your book. And I would encourage folks to go read that part, especially because it gives context to the next part of this. You were involved in a friendly fire incident in Afghanistan that you've been very open about. It's so funny because when I bring you up sometimes, people bring this incident up as if it's something you've been trying to hide or something that's like you've been trying to obfuscate. I'm like, you wrote a book. There's like a whole section in there dedicated to this.
There's a whole chapter in there, man.
Whole chapter in there about this. But I do want to touch on that briefly because I read your book, and as I was reading, it's so interesting. I guess in my position, knowing you, I've known you for a couple of years now, and I never read your book. And then one day I decided, you know what? I'm going to read this dude's book. So I'd already known you. Then I read your book. And now I'm like, oh my God, I've got a lot of questions about to this person that I thought I knew. And this gave me better context. After that incident, you come home, you redeploy. You've been very clear and open about the whole situation. I don't need to go and rehash all that. What I was curious about was the weight that was on your shoulders coming home, even though you knew I did what I was supposed to do. I made critical decisions. Not every decision is going to be right, but I made a decision based on the information I had. You still have this weight on your shoulders. You're in the Ranger Battalion. You're looking at a potential career in SF. Were there doubts? Were there self-doubts involved in that decision to go to SFAS? Were there obstacles within your own mind, within your own soul, spirit, whatever it is, that might have been telling you, no, you shouldn't do this?
No, not necessarily voices telling me no, that I shouldn't do it. I mean, yes, there was an incredible amount of like shame attached to all of that, embarrassment, that like I was a failure as a soldier. But I mean, a lot of that really just kind of motivated me and made me I knew that if I quit now, if I was threw in the towel, got out of the Army, like I knew this was something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. And so like after that deployment in Afghanistan, I mean, 6 months later, I'm on the next deployment with Ranger Battalion going to Iraq. So I mean, I didn't really slow down at all. And then the same thing going to SF was just like, all of that was sort of, part of it was my way of putting it behind me and proving to myself that, this one event doesn't define who I am, and that I can do my job, and that I can be a soldier, and I can do all of these things. So, I mean, I think a lot of it was motivating more than anything.
Does it ever, and this is funny because like for me, there are things in my career, in my life that, it's not that I'm not proud of, but they definitely weren't my finest and shiningest moments.
Yeah.
And those moments, and maybe other people can relate to this. For some reason, they decide to come creeping around 2:30 in the morning when I'm trying to sleep, and these things can, they'll haunt me a little bit. It's been a couple decades since this whole situation. Does this still bother you at times? Does it ever kind of come up and then you have to push this back down, or are you far enough removed?
It does come up into my mind once in a while, and you can get into that sort of like, and I realized a long time ago, like I could relitigate this event in my mind every hour of every day for the rest of my life, and I kind of deliberately chose not to. And I wrote about it, from the AARs that we did when I was in Ranger Battalion all the way up to writing about it in this book. I mean, I've talked about it in different ways, but I realized, like, again, I can't let this one event define my entire life. So it does come up once in a while, but I mean, I don't have like intrusive thoughts about it really. It's not something that I walk around with on my shoulders every day at this point. It's something that I guess I was able to put behind me. And I hope all of the other soldiers who were out there that day have also been able to, kind of close that chapter of their life and move on.
Did you talk to anybody? Did you talk to any professionals? Was this something that you went and sought professional help for to move past, or was this like some self-help, some self-journey thing going on there?
No, I mean, never talked to anybody about it until many, many years later. I met with a VA psychologist a few times, and I told her the story. I was in my 30s, by that point. But no, I didn't really talk to anybody about it.
I'm always curious about this because, I have a background in mental health, and it was a situation where I went and pursued that career because I was having issues. It was one of those heal thyself kind of things. A lot of people that I've talked to have had situations that never became public, that never got investigated, that never made never became known, and they carry these things with them to this day. You went through a very heavy situation that you went very open and public with. You wrote about it. You have talked about moving past these things. So that's why it's one of the questions that was lingering in the back of my mind as I read that chapter in your book. Like, how did you get over this? Like, what was the process for you to?
Well, it sounds cliched, right? But I mean, the Ranger Creed is right there. That is the guidance for all Rangers when in the absence of orders. And I was probably not given the best counseling by my unit, frankly. I mean, I owe that unit a lot. They, in a sense, forgave me and let me continue to serve. I'm forever grateful for them. But it's not like I was receiving any like mentorship about like. And I don't think anyone really knows how to handle a situation like this, because it's one of those things that everyone wants to kind of sweep under the carpet. No one wants to talk about it. And I didn't want to talk about it either, to be perfectly blunt. But, the Ranger Creed does provide some guidance in these moments. And, there's nothing in there about quitting. There's nothing in there that says it's okay to just give up. So, I mean, initially, that was kind of what helped me get over it. So not get over it is the wrong word, but keep pushing forward, and that was the initial inspiration, I think.
Homes for Our Troops, HFOT, is a publicly funded nonprofit organization that builds and donates specially adapted custom homes nationwide for severely injured post 9/11 veterans to enable them to rebuild their lives. These homes restore some of the freedom and independence our veterans sacrificed while defending our country. Nearly 90 cents out of every dollar spent has gone directly to supporting our veterans and enabling them to rebuild their lives. Visit hfotusa.org. That's hfotusa.org to learn more. Wreaths Across America Radio is a voice for America's veterans, an awesome mix of contemporary country, patriotic, and public service programming. And now Military Matters is proud to include itself into that mix. So now you can listen to this podcast, Military Matters, Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard and Sundays at noon on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on the iHeart Radio, TuneIn, and Audacy apps. It's interesting because, going forward now, you get through SFAS, you're in the Green Berets, you're a special forces soldier. You're encountering new challenges. And you just mentioned something very interesting, that you didn't feel like, hey, I didn't have the mentorship. And there are a lot of situations that happen in the military that aren't great.
Yeah.
They get swept under the rug. And it's because organizations are protecting themselves, and sometimes they're protecting a myth about the organization, a mystique. They're protecting the mystique, they're protecting the legend that is the organization. I kind of want to I don't mean to gloss over the Green Beret timeline, but I do want to get to some of this journalism that you decided to
Sure.
get into. Um, what was your idea from like all of this military experience to going into journalism, having seen some of these things being swept under the rug and seeing some of these things that happened around you? Tell me about that funnel, that off ramp that you took into journalism from this military career.
Well, I mean, that was certainly a process and an odd one at that. When I got out of the military, I started going to school. I was at Columbia University. I was a new father. I had a lot going on, and I ended up starting up a company, a startup company. I was co-founded this company that was kind of like a news and information website for special operations. And very shortly, I realized, or at least I came to the conclusion, I don't want to just be telling war stories from like, here's how it was back in 2005, right? Like, a couple of those are okay, but like you need to report the news, right? So that was kind of my entryway into journalism, was like trying to find stories, report on stories, and traveling abroad also, traveling back to the Middle East and doing original reporting. And that was sort of my entryway into journalism. And again, I didn't have any sort of like mentorship. I didn't have anyone telling me how to do this. I was a de facto in charge. There's no one telling me what to do. And I was managing other writers and other reporters and all of this. And so, I mean, I probably made every single mistake there is to make along the way. But it was really just trying to figure it out.
Let's talk a little bit about your trips overseas in the Middle East as a journalist. You are you trained as a journalist? Or are you
No.
So you're going out there with like what you think you should be doing.
Yeah. I mean, there was a clear delineation in my mind that I was not a soldier anymore, that I was a journalist. So, I was not trying to get into combat. I was not picking up guns. I was not shooting. I was, pen and paper in hand. So I did have some inkling of that. But what I was doing, which I mean, I think I didn't even realize at first, was that I was continuing to try to like be some sort of a bad, right? That I was going into these war zones. I was putting myself at risk, that I was doing all these things, trying to keep that like adrenaline going. And I think it was many years later that I fully realized like what I was doing, and really what it comes down to is like, I'm still trying to prove myself to myself, you know? But no, I was a political science in college. I never took a class in journalism. So yes, I was basically figuring it out as I went.
When I read your book, you talk about some of these undertakings that you took, going out to the Middle East alone and unafraid, as it were. And as I was reading this, I couldn't help but to think, this is really stupid. Like,
yeah,
what are you doing?
And it's a lot dicier than anything I did in the military too.
You had no backup. There was no cavalry here. I was, I'm reading about you taking these giant risks, trying to get the story, meeting these people. Looking back, and there's a lot of young people coming out of the military now. I hate to say it, but we've shuttered up these wars in the Middle East for the most part. A lot of young soldiers are getting out. They're looking around. They're thinking, well, I've got the skill set. Maybe I can go be an investigative journalist, or maybe I can go war correspondent or something like that. Looking back on those early years of your career, what would some of your advice be to young aspiring journalists with this military background that might want to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, that's a huge topic. I mean, I think first and foremost, I would say do it for the right reasons. You don't have to prove that you're a badass anymore. Like, you let that go. Now, if you really enjoy travel and you enjoy traveling to conflict zones and you like interviewing people and you want to put the story together, which is something I did, it wasn't either or. But if you're throwing yourself into danger all the time, eventually you're going to get killed. And I would not want people to do that again because they're trying to prove something to themselves. Like if you have to take some risks to get the story and you decide that the risk is worth the gain, then those are always trade-offs that journalists in conflict zones have to make. But I've definitely known a lot of people who have done reckless things. And I think that, especially with conflict journalists, it can become very egocentric, very quickly. And I don't think that necessarily lends itself to good journalism either. And then of course I also knew a lot of people who came out of the military and became foreign fighters and just joined up with the Peshmerga and the YPG and all that, and the Azov battalion in Ukraine, so I advise those people too, like, don't do it. Like just don't. Again, they're sort of in the same mentality in the sense that they're trying to prove something to themselves. They're chasing something. They're trying to find something.
But you can relate to that, though. I mean, as a person who was like looking at the French Foreign Legion, for crying out loud, you're like, oh, well, that could have been a really different journey for a young Jack Murphy.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can relate to them on a lot of different levels. And now that I'm maybe a little bit older, my advice to them is a little bit different, because I have seen some of these guys get killed, and I have been at their memorial services, and I've seen that. And, I was at a memorial service in Manhattan a ways back for a guy he was not a veteran. He was actually an activist, and he joined up with the Kurdish YPG militia. He was like one of these like anarchist type dudes who went over there. And I mean, he was a good guy by all accounts, was killed while fighting ISIS over there. And I'm sitting there watching at his memorial, and when his face pops up on the screen, I hear a voice of a little girl sitting right behind me. That's my daddy. And I'm like, yeah, man, it's like this stuff is real. And I don't say this to diminish anyone's sacrifice, but I mean, I wish he had stayed home and been a dad, right?
Yeah, 100%. Your work in the journalism field, reporting, has shifted a little bit in the last couple of years. Not so much back in the Middle East or trying to go out there and pull these stories. It seems like a lot of the stories are coming to you. People reach out to you to tell their story or to report an injustice or give you that tip that says, hey, there's smoke and fire here. I don't know how to expose this. Tell me a little bit about those processes. How has that shift occurred? And how do you perceive yourself now as the journalist of today?
Well, the shift occurred over a period of time, and I think it was probably 2018 or so. So I had made a couple trips to Syria, a couple trips to Iraq, a trip to the Philippines. And that last one was like 2017. So I think it was 2018, and I can't remember the exact date, but I was at home and I woke up and I remember distinctly getting out of bed, and I must have been having dreams or something. This feeling just washed over me where I realized I don't have anything to prove to anyone, even myself. I was like, that part of my life is over now. And so, I mean, I would go back overseas to report, but it has to be for a reason, not to just go over there and say like, hey, I'm this bad dude. Like, here's what I'm doing in Ukraine, and I have a camera and this. No, it's gross and it almost exploitative. I feel like, so I haven't done those types of trips anymore. I did, yes, throw myself into reporting on a lot of sexual assaults and domestic violence and suicides in the military. And quite frankly, I worked on a lot of those stories. And again, in a different sort of way, I thought I was this big tough guy, that I could report on all this stuff, and I can do things that other people can't do, and I can handle this. And over the years, it became crushing. I remember the last couple stories I did a story about Michael Frody and another story about Bill Mulder. Michael was in a secret classified Army intelligence unit, and Bill Mulder was a SEAL Team 6 operator. They both took their own lives. And those two stories, I mean, by the time I got to them, I remember my hands would just not work at the keyboard. Like I had just hit some sort of wall. And because of who I am and I realize I'm not like totally emotionally in touch with myself, like my body has the reaction before my mind does, right? And so my fingers won't work. I can't type this story out. What's going on? Why I've never had this sort of like quote unquote writer's block. And I realized like, yeah, this is just like stacked up on me, man. It's wearing down on me. You know, I'm talking to women crying their eyes out on the phone, scared to death because, you know, they were raped by a lieutenant colonel, you know, whatever, all kinds of different stories like this. And it got to me. So I don't want to say I've put that stuff behind me. I will write about it again. I've reported on it for Military Matters. I've done stuff on this subject, but I have been trying to focus over the last maybe year or so more on operations and getting back to writing about covert operations and special forces missions and special forces history stuff. Just as a bit of a break, it doesn't mean I'm never going to go back to reporting overseas or that I'm not going to report on, you know, domestic violence in the military. I'm sure I will at some point, but I am trying to take a little break from some of those things.
What do you say to the folks that have accused you of trying to tarnish or to hurt the reputation of the different organizations, the Rangers, Special Forces? Your name is the name that when I bring it up with certain folks, they either love you or they hate you. And one of those points of hate is all he does is report negative stuff about special operations. All he does is report negative stuff about SOCOM. How do you feel about those accusations? What do you tell those folks?
Well, first off, I mean, I would strongly refute the notion that I only report bad stories or negative stories about the special operations community. I write all kinds of positive stories about the special operations community. I write about the very rich history of special forces. Whenever I love working on those stories, I love reporting on them and writing them. I write about the positive things that the guys in our community do. But here's the thing about journalism is everyone, the readers, I mean, people will tell you, we want to see the good news. How come you don't write more good news? Well, the thing is, a lot of us do, but no one reads it. And we have data on that now proving that people do not gravitate towards those positive stories. They don't read them. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to write them. I will never not write those kinds of good stories about guys doing good things. And there are guys all across the special operations community doing great work every single day. And I will never not write about that. Sometimes the reasons why those stories don't get written is because you have public affairs officers that are not very good at their job, and will actually stonewall you from writing those types of articles. It's I've had 2 go rounds with SOC Corps, Special Operations Korea, trying to write positive things about the great stuff that they do. And their PAOs fumbled it both times. I don't understand why. So there's that for starters. Now, as far as like me trying to tarnish the special operations community, first off, why? I'm not the one that, beats their wives or, rapes the E5 in the office or holds their teenage daughter hostage at gunpoint. Like, it's you guys who do those things. Not all of you, but some of you do those things. And you are psychotic if you think that members of your formations can do those things and everyone should just keep quiet about it and that it should not be reported on. And I think that speaks to the insular nature of special operations, that some of these guys, particularly the officers and senior NCOs, think that their integrity is beyond reproach, that they cannot be criticized, that they resent anyone looking at their units and reporting on them critically. But listen, my message to you would be, when your soldiers stop sexually assaulting other soldiers and civilians, then I won't report on it. It's as simple as that. Now, I know it's not fair, and I would never seek to blame the entire institution for a soldier that does something criminal. I do think that there are sometimes drivers within the institution, particularly when there's a cover-up, that enable these types of things to happen. But again, the vast majority of the special operations guys out there are doing the right thing. They're doing really good things for our country. But when somebody smuggles cocaine in a punching bag from Korea or from Colombia, or takes their family hostage at gunpoint, like that stuff's going to be reported on. And I think you have to be very naive to think that myself or the press cannot and should not report on those things.
There was a discussion not too long ago, and it came up during a couple of months after the fall of Afghanistan, if you will. We've taken a lot of our forces out of Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. We still operate. There's still special operations taking place all over the world, but for the most part, those theaters, the level of operation is definitely dwindled. It's come down a lot smaller. We've got a lot more special operations guys kind of floating around that don't have the missions that they had before. Special Forces has been Army Special Forces has made it very clear that it's almost kind of going back to what we were originally built for. Force multipliers, training indigenous forces, that kind of stuff. The discussion that came up was, well, all these special operations guys are going to be floating around, not being able to go out and do these missions they were doing in Afghanistan. They're going to start getting in trouble. Bad things are going to happen. They're going to start committing crimes and whatnot. Do you give that theory any credence that without these missions, all these special operations guys are going to find themselves getting in trouble?
Not particularly in that manner. I think there probably is a validity to the argument that we have created a generation of soldiers who are traumatized by war. I think that's just a fact. Some people probably don't want to hear that. But we took a generation of young men and we deployed them to combat over and over and over again. And their commanders pretended that as long as these guys showed up for work and were deployable, they're good to go. A lot of these guys were not good to go. They were struggling. They're struggling with the deaths of their teammates, the things that they saw in war. And sometimes that lends itself to substance abuse issues, abusing opioids and other drugs, alcohol abuse, all of that. So there is a social consequence of all of this. There is a fallout from the war. And now you have all of these guys that you tell them, hey, thanks for showing up. Now the war's over. And how do you, if you've been to Afghanistan 10 times, 12 times, whatever the case may be, maybe just 5 times, maybe 3 times, who knows what it is, but how does that sit with you? Now you're going to go and train on garrison. Maybe you'll get a J set. You'll go over to, Senegal and train some soldiers for a little while, there is a social fallout of all of this. And I think the military doesn't do a very good job of taking any responsibility for it. Because usually what it's kind of dealt with as a sort of singular issue that, hey, that guy is doing cocaine or he got a DUI, or he did this or that. Well, that guy, kick him out of the army. It's like, well, yes, he's personally responsible for the mistakes he's made, but there is a bigger picture here. And, his unit doesn't take any responsibility for that at all.
I want to talk a little bit about that level of responsibility, taking responsibility. Again, this is another situation where I would definitely refer somebody to your book. This is another situation you've talked about openly, and that has to do with the videos of the Special Forces guys that were engaged in Africa. There was helmet cam footage. There was other footage that was involved. You have been blamed for lack of better words. You've been blamed for exposing that to the public and kind of exploiting that. That's the way it's been explained to me. Well, like, this guy did that. He exploited that. This is not a question for a huge explanation. I think you were very clear in your book about what happened in that situation and why things went the way they went. But I am curious though, that situation definitely brought a lot of heat on you. A lot of folks definitely soured on you, and I continue to hear that argument. Since that situation, I've also seen you kind of grow. not necessarily because of it, because it seems like people are beginning to come around and understand what happened. Maybe they read your book, maybe they read your articles, maybe they've listened to one of your many interviews on that subject. Do you feel that you are moving past that you know, the responsibility that you've taken personally and professionally? Where do you feel you're going now? Do you feel like the community is kind of changing its opinion, or do you feel like people are just stuck in what they're in?
I don't think anything much has changed. I mean, I'll just say this much. I mean, I'm not going to make a bunch of excuses. I'll say that that video was handled in a certain way. Some of it were decisions that were not mine to make. They were just made. However, I was the editor in chief of the website, so I'm still responsible for it. But it was handled in a certain way, and it could have been handled in a more professional way, I think. So yes, I have had quite a bit of time to think about all of this and speak to people. And yes, it could have been handled in a much more professional way. It could have been, and it should have been. But I mean, as far as, you know, let's say the special operations community, I mean, when I go to a lot of like events, especially over the last year, I've been to a lot of like different events for the Special Forces Association, the OSS Gala. I've been to a bunch of different charity events this year. And whenever I meet with guys from, you know, in quote unquote, the community, always very positive, very productive conversations, really nice guys. That I'm really privileged to know, quite frankly. The anger, that's mostly confined to the internet. People who don't know me, who have never met me. It's at a certain at a certain point, I feel like maybe it's like just cathartic for them, or like they're going through some things in their personal life that they need to lash out at other people. So, I mean, yeah, it is sort of like for me, in my experience, at least, it's a phenomena that's kind of confined to the internet. And when I talk to people, it's a much, talk to people in person, it's just a much different atmosphere. But I mean, yeah, there are people out there who are going to judge me for that. There are people out there who are going to judge me for the articles I wrote, that they feel embarrassed special forces. There are people out there who don't like me for that. And they don't like me because I was once one of them, and they view it as treasonous. And, you know, they also know that they can't really hide from me the way they can hide from another journalist. And I know for a fact that, you know, other journalists, you know, from major publications, the group's SF group's deputy commander will get on the phone with them and just bamboozle them and be like, everyone, morale is high. Everyone loves it here. It's great. And they take that at face value because they don't have any other sourcing. Well, I have other sourcing, and so I don't need to listen to your lies. And there is a segment of the community that just doesn't like that. They don't like having someone like me out there floating around, and they view it as like a treason. They feel that, you know, I should be out there with a marching baton at the head of the parade advocating for special forces. But as a journalist, it's not necessarily your job to advocate for an organization.
I am curious about one part of this situation. And again, this was another thing. I'm reading your book, and before we sat down and talked, I actually went back and reviewed some of your books so I could, you know, remember some of these details. One thing that stands out to me about that footage and the situation that blew up from it was, and you hit on it again. There were decisions made that you weren't part of, but as the man in charge of that editorial section, you took responsibility. That's a very military thing to do. That's a very military thing to say. The buck stops here. I'm going to take, you know, I'm put on my vest and take these heat rounds. Did you ever feel at some point like, this isn't fair? I shouldn't be taking these heat rounds. I didn't do X, Y, and Z, and just tell the public it's those guys. They did this, not me. I shouldn't be taking the heat that I'm taking.
So, some of those guys were inexperienced people who worked underneath me. Maybe if I were to point upwards at my CEO, actually, I have no love lost with the CEO of that company, and I would happily throw him under the bus. but I'll just have to be completely candid. Like, he had very little to do with it. Like, that dude was just so checked out. He's like off in, La La Land while his subordinates are running the company for him. The guys who were more, behind some of that stuff or doing some of those things, they were more inexperienced guys who worked under me. And I mean, if you're on my squad, like, I don't throw you under the bus. That's just how it is, So I mean, yeah, you can whine like, it's not fair, but who gives a shit? It is what it is, it doesn't really matter.
Going forward, you have started doing a lot of stories about special operations, the history, and your podcast, The Team House, reflects this. You get a lot of, I hate to say weird, but you get some interesting people on this show. Tell me about the Team House. What inspired you to start a podcast about this world of special operations that's now international? Your show, you bring people from all sorts of countries onto your show, CIA guys, DIA guys, even. Where is this show going? How did it start?
So the Team House also has an odd origin story in that, so I was working at the aforementioned company with the lunatic CEO where I was increasingly unhappy. And I had this idea of starting a side business. It was originally going to be a gaming company. So I set up all this. I rented out a studio. I bought a lot of expensive audio video equipment, set everything up to do live streaming. That business endeavor wasn't really going anywhere. Not as fast as I wanted it to, of course. Things became untenable at my day job, and I eventually, I left that company. I was like, I'm out of here. Goodbye. And I had done podcasting with them since about 2012. We did a podcast. Me and a guy, he remains a good friend of mine, Ian Scotto, produced that podcast. Now he does one called Battle Line with Chris Peranto. Really good guy, but me and him worked together closely for years. But we both left that company. Now I'm homeless, so to speak, but I do have this studio with all of this equipment set up. And so I think it was like the next day after I quit my job, the Team House episode 0 begins. And I interviewed a friend, a journalist friend, Joe Lefebvre, was the first episode. I think like the second episode, my old friend of mine, Dave Park, asks if he can get involved. Like, hell yeah, I could use all the help I can get. And so we start building it from there. And the show is primarily interviewing guests. It's interviews about their lives from kind of front to back. And they all have interesting careers. Some of them were special operations. Some of them were intelligence community people. Some of them were mercenaries. Some of them got involved in all sorts of weird stuff. Sometimes we do some federal law enforcement. I mean, if you look at like our YouTube page or our iTunes page, I mean, you'll see all kinds of interesting characters. And, when you say that, like, there are, kind of weird people on here, that this isn't like the usual cast of characters you see on these military podcasts. I mean, that's exactly what I want to hear, but that's like a very deliberate thing that I set out to do, is that I want to interview people who are not normally interviewed. I want to go after those stories that haven't been told yet. And so, yeah, I'm not trying to get like the celebrity veterans. I'm trying to get the guy who served for 20, 30 years in, the dark corridors of the intelligence community or the special ops community, or in some cases both, who has never been interviewed before, who's never told his story before. Those are the really exciting shows that I like to do. And now the Team House is at I think we're at like episode 230. We're about to hit 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So the last like 4 or 5 months, we've really seen like a lot of growth. But I mean, it's taken 3 years to build it up to this point. But I think we're all really happy with it.
Tell me about a story. You get these interesting guys, they sit down with you, and sometimes there's some whiskey involved, sometimes there isn't. But you're sitting down with these guys, and if you're anything like me, you don't want to know too much about them. right? You want to know a little bit about them, enough that you vetted them, you're going to have a great conversation, but you want to hear the story for the first time too. You want to hear these, and you're exploring. Has a guest ever dropped a story on your lap that you were just like jaw dropped? I'm sorry, what did you say? Like X, Y, and Z. And you're like, well, damn, didn't know that.
I mean, there's quite a few, and I'm struggling to think of a few specific examples. We interviewed one guy named Greg Smith, who was Eric Prince's right-hand man through some of his, contracting endeavors. And some of the stories he was talking about Prince trying to set up a mercenary army in the UAE and then going into business with the Chinese Communist Party to set up another aviation company. It's like, holy shit. And again, that's a guy, I don't know if he's ever really been interviewed before. We interviewed Mike Taylor, who smuggled Carlos Ghosn, the Lebanese billionaire, out of Japan while he was on sort of house arrest. We had him on recently, but I mean, we've interviewed Peter McAleese, who was a former SAS guy who was hired for a mercenary job to go and assassinate Pablo Escobar, and would have done it during infill to the target. The helicopters crashed in the mountains. So, I mean, just all kinds of wild stories, and sometimes stories, untold stories from the global war on terror. Also, you talk to these guys who were in special ops, who were in JSOC. A lot of them went to work for the CIA after they retired, and you just hear these like incredible, eye-opening stories.
So now that you're being released from Military Matters with extreme prejudice, mind you, we are terminating you
for cause.
For cause. It's not good, folks. You expect lawsuits. Now that you're moving on, what are you moving on to? Is it Team House? You're going to dedicate 100% to this? Your gaming? Are we ever going to get your gaming company off the ground?
Probably not, unfortunately. But I will say this. So I left the company that I co-founded and was kind of emotionally invested in, and kind of at the same time went through some personal stuff, marriage falling apart. It was a pretty dark time in my life. And
let's talk more about that. Let's talk more about your dark times.
And then COVID hits. Yeah. You have like $500 in the bank account. And it's like, wow, this is not cool, folks. This is not cool.
We've all been there, brother.
I mean, it happens, right? And again, it's like I referenced before, the Ranger Creed, you go into these dark places, but at that point, that's when you need to buckle down, keep things simple, and kind of go with what you know, and kind of rebuild your life back to a good place. But I got the job with connectingvets.com at Audacy. That was the first job I got coming out of the gate, and I'm still with them and I'm staying with them. They've been very good to me. And then you hired me to work for Military Matters. And that was honestly at that point, I was part-time at Connecting Vets. You hired me here. And that was kind of like that kind of was life-changing, quite frankly, because now I wasn't, struggling to pay rent every month. And that also enabled me to start up some of my own business endeavors. The Team House was something that I slowly built over those 3 years. When I was at the OSS gala dinner and sitting down with a journalist named Sean Naylor, we started talking about stories we have on the back burner that we always wanted to write. So he and I started a Substack, a news outlet called The High Side that has been pretty successful. And we plan it. I'm still writing for that, and I'm working on drafts now. So the long-term plan is to really dedicate myself to my own businesses and work for myself. That's like the long-term plan. And maybe sometime in the next couple of years, I can really do that. I'm going to continue working with Connecting Vets for now. But the only reason why I was stepping away from Military Matters is just because it became too much, man. I have like 4 or 5 jobs, and it gets to the point where like I'm just going to start sucking at all of them, or I can just let 1 or 2 of them go and kind of refocus my efforts. So that's why I kind of decided to step away. But I mean, it's for good reasons. It's all good stuff that's happening. And I'm definitely not in that hole that I was in, not that long ago, 3-4
Yeah.
years ago.
That's interesting. A lot of us, I think veterans in general, we go through this transition period. We always talk about the transition out of the military into civilian sector. That's cool too. But there's these little micro transitions that happen
Yeah.
afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those micro transitions are very positive and it's great. You get that great job or whatever, but sometimes they are painful as all hell, right? We're talking about those dark moments in our lives
Yeah.
where we start questioning whether any of our decisions that we've made up to this point were the right decisions. Wow, what is happening to me right now? So it's always good to see somebody who's gone through that moment come out on the other end better, in a better situation, ready to tackle the next challenge. I wish you absolutely the best, man. I can't tell you how critical you've been to the success of this podcast. I love how you've challenged our vision. You've shaped and molded this show, and you've definitely kept our editor on his toes. He's probably happy to see you leave. He's like, oh my God, I can actually sit back and have a cup of coffee. But going forward, is there a story you want to tell? Is there something you're working on or something you want to work on? A book, a comic? Maybe you want to start getting up at 3 a.m, recording yourself in black and white, telling us to get up and how lazy we are. I love you, Jocko. I'm just messing.
So, yeah, I mean, there are a couple things, a couple big stories that I'm working on. One of them that I can definitely talk about a little is I'm working on a story about the American hostages that were held by FARC in Colombia from 2003 to 2008. That's going to be like a multi-part series that'll show up on the high side on our Substack. I'm working on the draft of that. There's another really big story about a secret government program that I'm working on. Sean and I are working on, actually, with a couple other journalists. So that's going to take some time. It's a big one. There is a book that I would like to write, taking some of the stuff I've worked on previously and taking some of the things I'm working on now, a Special Forces history book. And it's sort of the way I don't know what the title is going to be, but it's sort of the theme of it is the lost chapters of Special Forces history. So it's not going to be like a chronology of Special Forces since the 1950s. I mean, other people have written these books, right? This is going to be about the lost chapters, the things, the subjects and the programs and the secret programs and things throughout the history of the Special Forces Regiment that really have not been written about. And maybe you heard like whispers of, and maybe you heard rumors about. So, I mean, I've done a lot of work on that already. And I've just started work on what I thought would be the final chapter of it, which is a program called Greenlight. I started doing interviews for that. That is the program where guys were parachuting in with the subatomic munition device, the SATM. So I've just started working on that. And then I think there may be another chapter to this book. See, with a project like this, you could just work on it forever and never get it released. So I kind of tried to limit myself to 4 topics. But I think now that I had something land in my lap, that I think there may be 5 chapters or 5 topics. This one about some 1980s Latin America type stuff that went down that no one really knows about. So there may be 5 topics in this book. So that'll be Blue Light, America's first dedicated counterterrorism unit; Green Light, the SATM teams; Detachment K in Korea, the Special Forces resident team in Korea; Detachment A, which is the special ops guys in Berlin; and then the 5th one being the Latin America story. So
yeah. It's interesting how we're like getting along in our age, or the time is passing. Enough time is passing now that these classified things that occurred in like the 80s, the 70s,
right.
the 90s, all these things are kind of like coming out, and we're all kind of going, whoa, there was a lot going on during that time.
And so I have no fear for job security in this regard, that like I'm never going to run out of stuff to write about. imagine all the stuff that happened during the GWAT that we're going to be writing about more and talking about more and more. I've had meetings just this week hearing about intelligence operations that we ran during the war on terror that would blow your mind. Like, people will be like, holy shit. And it takes a lot of work to get these stories to the point where they can be published because of all the sourcing that I have to shore up. But I mean, I will say, yeah, I am sitting on some like pretty big stories, about the past and GWAT era stuff as well, that I just need to tie up the sourcing and, get it out there. But there's no shortage of material to write about.
So as these stories come out, where can we find them? Where can we find out more about Jack Murphy?
So I think these stories, that you'll see them all on the high side, on our Substack, and you search for it. I think it's like $5 a month. And we're not going to, honestly, to be candid, we're not bombarding our members with content. It's not news of the day. It's really long form investigative journalism. So you'll get like a 10,000 word story like every month, every other month. So that's kind of the nature of it. But some of these bigger stories I'm talking about, yeah, they'll wind up there.
And what is that Substack? Some folks are not familiar with this. They're listening. You say Substack. They're like, is this in Home Depot? What am I finding?
You don't really have to know what Substack is. It doesn't matter. It's just a platform for publishing. And so you can go there. You can go ahead and look up the high side with Jack Murphy and Sean Naylor. You can subscribe. I think it's like $5 a month. And you will receive, whenever we publish something, you will receive an email and say, hey, this story is out. Or you can go to the website itself and read it there. And that's really all it is. It's just a publication platform for journalists to independently publish their material.
And there you go, folks. You can also find him on Twitter, Jack Murphy, RGR. You can find him everywhere. He's very consistent with his handle, Jack Murphy, RGR. If you've got a tip, you got something you want to shoot his way, you want him to look into it. He's got a Proton Mail. What is it again?
It's Jack Murphy Reporter at protonmail.com.
So he changed it up for us. Instead of RGR, we went for Jack Murphy Reporter.
It's only because somebody already took it, or they wouldn't let me have it for some reason.
There you go. On behalf of everybody at Military Matters, Stars and Stripes, I would just want to thank you for everything you've done for us, all the stories that you've shared with this grateful audience. Thank you for everything you've done. And we wish you the absolute best of luck in everything you do in the future. And we hope to have you back.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rod, for, this opportunity. And look, I'm really, really proud of the work that we did here. When I go back and look at all these episodes, and I mean, we did some really heavy stories about, murders. We did some really lighthearted stories about like spooky Halloween stories and ghost tales. We did some real like deep dives on Russia, on China, on North Korea. And we did some really, really good work. I mean, not to pat myself on the back too much, but I mean, again, I am proud of what we accomplished here. And I hope that the listeners found all of that, to be meaningful.
Undoubtedly, the finest moments on this show have been your contributions to our stories about UFOs and aliens. I know how near and dear those stories are to your heart. Good luck, my guy. And if you need anything, you know where to find us. That was my conversation with Jack Murphy. Folks, if you haven't read his book, Murphy's Law, I'd highly recommend you pick it up. Murphy's Law, available everywhere you buy your favorite books. I'd recommend the audiobook, too, where you can have Jack Murphy whisper his sweet nothings into your ear directly. He narrates the book himself. Or you can just pick it up. I would recommend you just pick it up and read it. I don't know if you can deal with hours of Jack Murphy talking into your ear. Folks, that does it for us. Like, listen, subscribe, and leave us a review. I'm Rod Rodriguez. That was Jack Murphy, and we'll see you at the next episode. This episode was brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post 9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information. Now you can hear Military Matters Wednesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard and Sundays at noon on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on the iHeart Radio, TuneIn and Audacy apps.